March 6th, 1944. 28,000 feet over the German capital. Major Heinz Kanoka looks out from the cockpit of his Bf-109. Below him, Berlin is a grid of stone and smoke. For years, German pilots held a mental map of safety. They knew the British and American fighters had short legs. They knew the little friends had to turn back at the German border. Once the escorts hit their fuel limit, the bombers were defenseless. That was the kill zone. That was where the Luftwaffe feasted. Kanoka scans the horizon, expecting the sky to clear of Allied fighters. He expects the blue to belong to him again. Then he sees them. Small, silver silhouettes. Sleek. Aggressive. They aren't turning back. They are diving into the German formation with a velocity that feels personal. Kanoka feels a cold knot in his stomach. The geography of the air war has just collapsed. There is no longer a border. There is no longer a sanctuary. For the German pilot, the P-51 was no longer just an airplane. It was a predator that had learned to follow them all the way home. It was a machine that made death feel inevitable. This was the moment the war in the air changed forever. It was not a shift in numbers, but in psychology. The hardware responsible was the North American P-51 Mustang, specifically the B and C models, fitted with the Rolls-Royce Merlin engine and 75-gallon external drop tanks. This combination granted it a 1,100-mile combat radius, a technical fact German command had dismissed as impossible. The Mustang's arrival deep over Germany shattered the foundational logic of the Luftwaffe's defense. It transformed their homeland from a sanctuary into a hunting ground. This is not just a story of a superior fighter. It is the story of a specific machine that broke an Air Force's spirit by making every inch of sky it owned contested. March 1944. The air at 28,000 feet is a razor. It is a world of nitrogen and lethal cold. Major Heinz Kanoka looks out from the cockpit of his Messerschmitt Bf-109. He is a veteran of the Jagdwaffe. He has survived hundreds of sorties. He is currently flying over the outskirts of Berlin. Below him, the capital of the Reich is a grid of stone and industry. This was supposed to be the safest sky in Europe. It was supposed to be the ultimate sanctuary. For 3 years, the Luftwaffe lived by a clinical arithmetic of distance. They understood the physics of the enemy. They knew the American P-47 Thunderbolts and the British Spitfires had hard limits. These aircraft were short-legged. The Allied fighters always turned back at the German border. They turned back at the Rhine River. Kanoka and his men would wait for that specific moment. They would orbit outside the range of the escorts. They watched for the little friends to peel away and head for home. It was a rhythmic part of the war. The moment the escorts left, the heavy B-17 bombers were naked. They were massive, slow-moving targets. They were vulnerable. That was the kill zone. That was where the Luftwaffe feasted. It was a predictable slaughter based on fuel gauges. But as Kanoka scans the horizon today, the math fails. The logic of the air war has evaporated. He sees the glint of silver wings in the distance. He sees the sleek, low-drag profiles of the P-51 Mustangs. They are deep inside Germany. They are hundreds of miles past the point of no return. They are not turning back. They are holding their formation with a terrifying persistence. Kanoka watches as the Mustangs jettison their 75-gallon external tanks. These were the drop tanks that the German High Command claimed were impossible. The papier-mâché and steel cylinders tumble through the clouds. They look like spent shell casings falling from the sky. This is the visual signal of a death sentence. To a German pilot, it was the sight of a predator shedding its skin. By dropping those tanks, the Mustangs were transitioning. They were moving from cruise mode to combat mode. They were unlocking their full aerodynamic potential. They were ready to hunt. Kanoka feels a cold knot in his stomach. It is a physical reaction to a technical reality. The geography of the Reich has just collapsed. There is no longer a border. The Luftwaffe sanctuary has been transformed into a hunting ground. To the German pilot, the Mustang was no longer just an airplane. It was a predator that had learned to follow them home. It was a machine that made the entire concept of the front line obsolete. The sight of the four-bladed propeller over Berlin meant the Luftwaffe was no longer an air force. It was prey. The psychological wall had crumbled. The German pilots began to fear the Mustang more than they feared the fire of the bombers. In the old days, they would attack the B-17s with a sense of technical superiority. They had the cannons. They had the altitude. Now, they were being jumped from above by a fighter that could outturn and outrun them. The Mustang brought a new vocabulary to the sky. It was a vocabulary of constant threat. Every time a German pilot took off, he knew he was under observation. He knew the Mustangs were loitering over his own airfields. The P-51 had bypassed the defensive belt. It had bypassed the anti-aircraft batteries. It was a machine that prioritized the physics of endurance over the traditions of defense. Hermann Göring once famously said that if an Allied fighter ever appeared over Berlin, his name was Meyer. By March 1944, every pilot in the Luftwaffe knew the Reich was now owned by a man named Meyer. The P-51 didn't just bring machine guns to the fight, it brought the end of the German imagination of safety. Knoke tightened his grip on the control stick. He realized his Bf-109 was no longer the apex predator. He was flying a relic. He was a survivor in a world that had been redesigned by American industry. The Mustangs were diving now. They were gaining speed with every second. The sun caught their polished aluminum skins. They looked like silver knives cutting through the blue. For the German pilots, this was the moment the war ended. The rest was just a long, violent postscript. They were no longer defending a nation. They were struggling to survive in a sky that had been stolen from them. The arithmetic was simple. The Mustang had more fuel. It had more speed. It had more time. And in the air, time is the only currency that matters. The Luftwaffe was officially bankrupt. The P-51 was the collector at the door. The realization was a clinical trauma. It was a shift in the soul of the German Air Force. They weren't just being outproduced. They were being outthought. The machine in the distance was proof that their sanctuary was a lie. The Mustang was here, and it wasn't going anywhere until the Reich was silent. For the Luftwaffe, this was a tactical trauma. For North American aviation, it was a triumph of unintended consequences. In 1940, the British gave Edgar Schmood a 120-day deadline. He didn't just build a plane, he redesigned the physics of the sky. Traditional wings of the era were thick. They were curved toward the front. The design was reliable, but noisy. It created a massive aerodynamic wake. This is the boundary layer of air that clings to the skin. On a Messerschmitt, this air becomes turbulent quickly. It creates immense drag. Drag is the tax the sky collects on every gallon of fuel. The Germans accepted this tax as an inevitable law. Schmood did not. He utilized a radical concept, the laminar flow airfoil. The P-51 wing was different. Its thickest point was pushed much further back. The leading edge was sharper. The surface was incredibly smooth. The goal was to keep air flowing in smooth, parallel layers. By delaying turbulence, the Mustang reduced profile drag by nearly 50%. This was the secret arithmetic of the P-51. It wasn't just a big engine. It was needing less engine to push through the air. When German analysts first measured a captured wing, they were confused. To their eyes, the wing looked wrong. They saw it as a design flaw. They were wrong. It was a clinical breakthrough. This efficiency allowed a 300-mile-per-hour cruise on very little fuel. It turned the Mustang into a long-range athlete. But there was a catch. The laminar flaw meant the wing had to be perfect. Even chipped paint or crushed insects could disrupt the flow. The Americans solved this with industrial discipline. Every wing was filled with putty. They were sanded by hand until they were smooth as mirrors. The Germans looked at their own manufacturing. They saw rough welds and protruding rivets. They saw a machine built for the short term. The Mustang was built for the long game. It prioritized the molecular level of flight. The laminar wing gave the P-51 a unique, square silhouette. It became the signature of death for German interceptors. When a Mustang began its dive, it didn't just fall. It accelerated with a terrifying lack of resistance. German pilots realized they couldn't escape by diving. In the old language of air combat, the dive was the ultimate exit strategy. Against the Mustang, it was a trap. The P-51 reached its terminal velocity much later than the Messerschmitt. It remained controllable at speeds where German planes began to vibrate and shred. This was the technical foundation of dominance. It was an airplane that cheated the wind. But the wing was only the frame. To break the Luftwaffe, the Mustang needed a heartbeat that could sustain 30,000 feet. The Packard Hart was about to take the flight to the enemy's doorstep. The initial P-51 was a failure at high altitude. It used the Allison V1710 engine. This was a reliable power plant, but it lacked a two-stage supercharger. Above 15,000 feet, the early Mustang gasped for air. It lost its edge. It was a low-level racer, not a strategic interceptor. Luftwaffe pilots knew this. They felt safe at 25,000 feet. They believed the Americans could never bridge the gap between range and high-altitude power. Then came the Rolls-Royce Merlin, specifically the Merlin 61 series. The marriage created the P-51B. It changed the heartbeat of the air war, but Britain could not build the Merlin fast enough. Their factories were under constant pressure. They turned to Packard in Detroit. Packard was a master of American automotive precision. They took the Merlin blueprints and performed an industrial audit. They found that the British designs relied on hand fitting by craftsmen. Packard couldn't mass-produce a handmade engine. They redesigned the tolerances. They applied the logic of the American assembly line. They created the Packard V1650-7. This was a licensed Merlin built with American consistency. Every engine that left the factory was a masterpiece. The parts were interchangeable. The performance was guaranteed. The V1650-7 featured a two-stage, two-speed supercharger. This was the mechanical lung of the Mustang. It compressed the thin, freezing air of the upper atmosphere. Suddenly, the P-51 didn't lose power as it climbed. It thrived. It maintained a top speed of 437 miles per hour at 25,000 feet. It could operate effectively up to 41,000 feet. Luftwaffe pilots were used to the altitude sanctuary. If a dogfight went wrong, they would simply climb. They believed their Bf-109s owned the thin air. By mid-1944, that sanctuary was a graveyard. German pilots would lock up and see Mustangs loitering at 30,000 feet. The Packard Hart gave the P-51 the ability to dive from the sun. It gave them a gravitational advantage the Luftwaffe couldn't counter. The Merlin engine had a distinct guttural roar. It was a mechanical scream. It signaled the Reich's decline. German veterans spoke of the Merlin chill. It was the cold realization that the enemy was no longer struggling for breath. The Packard engine was incredibly resilient. It used high-octane 100-130 grade fuel. This allowed for extreme manifold pressures. The pilot could push the throttle into war emergency power. This provided a lethal burst of speed for 5 minutes. The Mustang could always find one more gear. It could always push one step further. The Packard Hart didn't just provide thrust, It provided confidence. It allowed American pilots to stay aggressive for 8 hours. For the Luftwaffe, this was a rhythmic torture. They were fighting an engine that never seemed to tire. They were fighting a machine that had mastered the chemistry of the high sky. But power and speed were still limited by the fuel tank. Range was still the ultimate barrier. The Germans believed they were safe because of geography. They believed the P-51 would always have to turn back. The drop tank trap was about to prove them wrong. Before the Mustang, the air war was a game of borders. German pilots believed in a red line of safety. They knew Allied fighters had to turn back when their fuel gauges hit a certain mark. This left the bombers alone for the final, most dangerous leg of the journey. The Luftwaffe called this the unprotected zone. It was their primary hunting ground. The P-51 shattered this logic with a simple, disposable invention, the drop tank. These were external fuel tanks mounted under the wings. The most common version was the 75-gallon tank. Early versions were made of steel, but the Americans soon transitioned to pressurized papier-mâché. These paper tanks were cheap. They were lightweight. Most importantly, they didn't use strategic metals. They allowed the Mustang to carry an extra 150 gallons of fuel for the trip into Germany. The Mustang would take off and climb using only the fuel from these external tanks. They would fly hundreds of miles into enemy territory, while their internal tanks remained completely full. German radar operators would watch the formations cross the border. They expected the escorts to turn around. They waited for the moment of vulnerability. Instead, they saw the Mustangs keep coming, over the Rhine, over the Ruhr, eventually over Berlin itself. When a dogfight began, the P-51 pilot would pull a lever in the cockpit. The external tanks would release and fall away. This instantly restored the plane's high-speed aerodynamics. The Luftwaffe's pilots were caught in a drop tank trap. They were intercepted by fighters that they believed couldn't possibly be there. The range was staggering. A P-51D, with two 108-gallon tanks, had a combat radius of 850 miles. It could fly from bases in England, engage in a 20-minute dogfight over Germany, and return home with fuel to spare. This ended the unprotected zone forever. The bombers were now shielded from takeoff to touchdown. For the German pilot, the psychological toll was massive. They were no longer safe, even in their own landing patterns. The little friends were no longer just visitors. They were permanent residents of the German sky. The drop tank wasn't just a container for fuel. It was a strategic lever that moved the front line of the war 1,000 miles to the east. But even with the fuel to reach the enemy, the American pilots still had to hit them. High-speed dogfighting was a chaotic, three-dimensional problem. To solve it, the Americans introduced a piece of technology that turned every pilot into a marksman. The K-14 arithmetic was about to automate the kill. Hitting a moving target at 400 miles per hour is not a sport. It is a geometry problem. It is a language of light, spoken in the heartbeat before a kill. The ace's lock, the marksman's trigger, a geometry spoken without a single word, understood only by those in the crosshairs. Your K-14 is your dialect. In the early years, pilots used the N3 fixed reflector sight. It was a simple glass plate with a projected crosshair. To hit a turning enemy, the pilot had to lead the target. He had to aim at empty space. He had to guess where the enemy would be when the bullets arrived. This was the deflection shot. It was the most difficult skill in aviation. It took years to master. It required the instinct of a hunter and the eye of a jeweler. But at 30,000 feet, instinct is a fragile thing. The K-14 gyro gun sight changed the arithmetic. It was a clinical breakthrough by the Sperry Corporation. It moved the guessing from the pilot's brain to a mechanical computer. The K-14 contained two gyroscopes. One tracked the rate of the aircraft's turn. The other tracked the pitch. The pilot didn't have to visualize the path of the bullets. He only had to identify the prey. On the throttle grip, there was a range-finding dial. The pilot set it to the target's wingspan. A Messerschmitt Bf-109 measured 32 feet, 8 inches. A Focke-Wulf 190 measured 34 feet, 5 inches. Once the span was set, a reticle appeared on the glass. It was a central dot surrounded by 6 glowing diamonds. The pilot adjusted the size of the ring using the throttle grip. He framed the enemy's wings from tip to tip within the diamonds. This simple act fed the range to the gyro computer. The reticle didn't sit still. It lagged behind the aircraft's motion. The lag was the calculation. It was the lead. If the diamonds framed the wing, the computer had already solved the geometry. The bullets in the target were now on an inevitable collision course. The pilot only had to squeeze the trigger. German pilots were used to snapshots. They knew that in a high-G turn, an American pilot could only score a lucky hit. They believed in the safety of the maneuver. The K-14 shattered that safety. Suddenly, Mustangs were scoring hits from deflection angles that were previously impossible. The Luftwaffe called it magic fire. They saw their comrades disintegrate during maneuvers that should have been safe. It was not magic. It was the K-14 arithmetic. It was the automation of the execution. The sight turned a green pilot into a lethal marksman. It allowed them to stay on target while pulling 5 times the force of gravity. The technical leverage was absolute. The K-14 corrected for the speed of the aircraft, the angle of the turn, and the drop of the .50 caliber rounds. For the German pilot, the sight of a Mustang behind him was no longer a duel of skill. It was a clinical audit of his survival. They realized the sky was being swept clean by a machine that didn't rely on luck. It relied on the precise spin of a gyroscope. This was the premium standard of the air war, a silent, glowing ring that spoke the final word in every conversation. But even the perfect sight needs a target. And by late 1944, the Luftwaffe was running out of its most precious resource, its elite pilots. The shift was starting. The legendary Abbeville kids were about to face a nightmare they couldn't outrun. The ghost of the Abbeville kids was coming for them. The K-14 sight made the Mustang a clinical executioner, but a weapon is only as effective as the targets it eliminates. By 1944, those targets were the elite corps of the Luftwaffe. In the early years of the war, Allied pilots lived in terror of the Abbeville kids. These were the veteran pilots of the Jagdgeschwader 26, JG-26. They were the apex predators of the Western Front. They were based in northern France, near the coast. They were famous for their yellow-nosed Focke-Wulf 190s. To a B-17 crew, a yellow nose in the distance meant a professional attack was imminent. The Abbeville kids were masters of the head-on pass. They specialized in high-speed, high-stakes interceptions. They were the gold standard of German air power. But the Mustang was an invasive species that ignored their reputation. The P-51 pilots didn't just defend the bombers. They went on the offensive. They began a campaign of fighter sweeps. They flew hundreds of miles ahead of the bomber boxes. They searched for the elite units. They targeted the yellow noses specifically. They were not there to defend. They were there to clear the sky. The veteran German pilots were used to dictating the terms of the fight. They used their home field advantage. They used the element of surprise. The Mustang took both away. By the summer of 1944, the Abbeville kids were disappearing. Elite leaders like Joseph Priller watched their veteran ranks vanish in a single afternoon. The P-51's speed meant there was no escape. Its range meant there was no place to hide. Even their own airfields were no longer safe. Mustang pilots began a tactic called bouncing the runways. They loitered at 20,000 feet near the German airstrips. They waited for the German fighters to scramble. They waited for the moment of maximum vulnerability. A Focke-Wulf 190 taking off is a heavy, slow machine. Its engine is running hot, its landing gear is still retracting. The Mustangs would dive from the sun at over 400 miles per hour. They would strike before the German pilots could even gain combat speed. This was not a duel of honor. It was a systematic execution. The loss of these veterans was a technical catastrophe for the Reich. A pilot with 2,000 hours of combat experience cannot be replaced by a trainee. The Luftwaffe's institutional memory was being erased. The legendary pilots became ghosts. Their skill was neutralized by the P-51's relentless presence. The Yellow Noses, once a symbol of dominance, became a target for every Mustang in the theater. The kids were being grounded by a machine that didn't just match their performance. It hunted them until their numbers reached the point of extinction. The hunter had officially become the prey. The sky over Germany was now a silver cage. The mission for the Luftwaffe had shifted. It was no longer about stopping bombers. It was about surviving the arrival of the Mustangs. The transition from masters of the Channel to the ghosts of the Reich was complete. The P-51 had broken the elite. Now, it was ready to protect the heavy metal of the 8th Air Force with total efficiency. The little friends were about to become the ultimate escort. The destruction of the elite units left the German sky wide open. This created the perfect environment for the Mustang to fulfill its primary mission. It became the ultimate protector of the big friends. In the early war, escort fighters were on a short leash. They were ordered to stay close to the bombers. They were purely defensive and reactive. This allowed the Luftwaffe to pick the time and place of every attack. They could orbit just out of range and wait for the perfect opening. General Jimmy Doolittle changed the arithmetic of the escort mission in early 1944. He issued a clinical order to the 8th Air Force. He told his fighter pilots that their duty was no longer to stay with the bombers. Their new duty was to hunt and destroy the German Air Force wherever they found them. This shift turned the P-51 into an offensive weapon. The Mustangs would fly miles ahead of the bomber boxes. They searched for the German staging areas. They hit the interceptors while they were still forming up. They caught the Luftwaffe while they were most vulnerable. For the B-17 and B-24 crews, the sight of the P-51 was a psychological lifeline. They called them the Little Friends. A single Mustang silhouette on the horizon meant the difference between a successful mission and a catastrophic loss. It meant the bombers were no longer alone. The technical efficiency of the escort was staggering. By mid-1944, the losses of the 8th Air Force began to plummet. The bomber formations were no longer under constant siege. The Mustang's range meant it could stay with the bombers for the entire duration of the mission. A typical deep penetration raid lasted 8 hours. The P-51 was there for every minute of it. It covered the trip from the English coast to the heart of the Reich and back. German pilots now faced a wall of silver. Every time they tried to approach a bomber box, they were intercepted. The Mustangs used their superior speed to close the gap. They struck before the German cannons could get in range. This created a dead zone around the bombers. Any German aircraft that entered the space was immediately targeted. The P-51 pilots used high-speed diving attacks to break up the German Sturmgruppen formations. The Luftwaffe tried to use heavy armor and 30mm cannons to kill the bombers. This made the German planes slow and heavy. Against an agile P-51, these Sturmwache were helpless. They were easy targets for the nimble Mustangs. The Mustang's presence was a clinical audit of German failure. The Luftwaffe could no longer reach the bombers without paying a lethal price. The ultimate escort had made the strategic bombing campaign a mathematical certainty. It had turned the tide of the industrial war. The German pilots realized the war of attrition was lost. They were fighting a machine that had perfected the art of the shield. But even a perfect machine had a breaking point. Every pilot knew the P-51 had one specific technical vulnerability. It was time to talk about the Mustang's hidden danger. The Mustang was not a perfect machine. It carried a secret technical vulnerability. This was the fuselage fuel tank. It was an 85-gallon tank located directly behind the pilot's seat. It was added to give the P-51 its legendary range, but it came with a heavy cost to stability. When this tank was full, It shifted the center of gravity too far to the rear. This made the aircraft longitudinally unstable. It was a clinical nightmare for the pilot. In a high-speed turn, the nose would snap up unexpectedly. The controls became dangerously sensitive. If pushed too hard, the Mustang would enter a violent high-speed stall. It could snap into a spin with almost no warning. American pilots were strictly warned. They were told not to engage in dogfights until the rear tank was at least half empty. German pilots eventually discovered this flaw. Veteran Luftwaffe aces tried to force the Mustangs into a turning fight early in the mission. They knew the P-51 was a clumsy, unstable bird while the rear tank was heavy. But the Americans adapted with clinical discipline. They learned to burn the fuel from the fuselage tank first. By the time they reached the kill zone over central Germany, the tank was empty. The center of gravity returned to its optimal position. The Mustang became a stable, lethal predator once again. The Luftwaffe's window of opportunity was small. It lasted only as long as the fuel in that rear tank. Once it was gone, the tactical advantage shifted back to the Silverwings. By early 1945, the Luftwaffe was a hollow shell. The P-51 had performed a systematic audit of German air power. It had removed the veteran pilots. It had neutralized the airfields. The Mustang pilots were now the undisputed owners of the German sky. They no longer just escorted bombers. They hunted anything that moved on the ground. They flew low-level strafing missions. They destroyed locomotives, fuel trucks, and parked aircraft. They made the German logistics system a graveyard of burned metal. The statistical dominance was absolute. The P-51 was credited with 4,950 aerial victories. This was more than any other Allied fighter in the European theater. It achieved a kill ratio of nearly 19-1. For every Mustang lost in air-to-air combat, 19 German aircraft were destroyed. The sound of the Packard Merlin became the sound of the end. German pilots often bailed out the moment they saw a Mustang silhouette on their tail. They realized the K-14 sight made the result a mathematical certainty. The Mustang didn't just win dogfights. It created a total silence over the Reich. The Luftwaffe was grounded by fear and a total lack of sanctuary. The P-51 had fulfilled the ultimate strategic goal. It had cleared the path for the final collapse of the German war machine. The P-51 Mustang was the ultimate hardware of the air war. It was the perfect marriage of the Laminar wing, the Packard heart, and the K-14 arithmetic. It proved that distance was no longer a defense. It proved that the high-altitude sanctuary was an illusion. The Little Friends had changed the architecture of history from 30,000 feet. They broke the spirit of the Luftwaffe by making the sky a contested space. They turned the German homeland into a trap. The Mustang remains a clinical example of how a single technical breakthrough can shift the psychology of an entire war. It was the machine that took the fight home. If this deep dive into the physics of psychology of the Mustang was compelling, acknowledge the data by liking this video. Subscribe for more strategic autopsies of the machines that defined history. Leave a comment below. If you were a German pilot in 1944, how would you have tried to survive an encounter with a P-51? Thank you for watching, and thank you for demanding the whole story.